Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Yes, so I'm Chris, and the man at the back is also Chris. And the reason he's filming is that I'm involved with a project called South Downs Generations, and that's really, as the name suggests, working with people of all generations from your age right up to the oldest people to record memories about the South Downs, their history, how they've changed, why people like the South Downs. Ah, right, the Normans. Is there a particular date that anyone associates with the Normans?
Every hand should be up.
Yes.
Come on, back row.
1066. 1066, perhaps the most famous date in English history. And this was the last time that England was successfully invaded, when people came over, took over the country and changed everything. And this shows, this is part of a huge tapestry. Anyone know what a tapestry is? Yes? How do you know how you make a tapestry? What do you use to make it? The threads, yeah, exactly, threads. It's needlework, it's not a painting, it's needlework. And this is part of a very famous tapestry, perhaps one of the most famous tapestries in the world, called the Bayeux Tapestry. And it's called Bayeux after a place in Normandy in France. And it was nuns who created this, and this is only a tiny bit of it. If you see the whole tapestry, it's in a massive room and it goes all the way around the wall. And it tells the story of how the Normans took over England. And the Normans originally came from Scandinavia. And the reason they're called Normans is because they were the Northmen or the Norsemen. And they took over that part of France, and they were very powerful, and they were very, very great in battle. And King Harold of England said, no, you're not going to have my country, I'm King of England, you won't get it. But unfortunately for Harold, he was invaded in the north of England by Vikings. And Harold and his army, and just imagine this, an army on foot, they had to walk everywhere. An army on foot walked all the way from London right up into Yorkshire and fought the Vikings at a battle called Stamford Bridge, and they won. Great victory, hooray! And then no sooner had they had the victory than King Harold was told, well, you've beaten the Vikings, but now the Normans have landed in Sussex. And so King Harold said, right, we're all going to march down straight away. No rest, fought a big battle, march all the way down through England. And they did it in about 3 or 4 days, walking in the autumn on those muddy, dreadful roads. Can you imagine how tired you'd feel by the time you got to Sussex? And when they got to London, people said to the king, don't go into battle now, rest, stay in London. London's safe because London's got a huge wall round it. But the king was so furious and angry that the Normans had landed, and their leader was Duke William of Normandy, and they hated each other. And so Harold said, I'm not waiting, I'm going to go down and beat them now. And he marched down, and there's a little town in East Sussex called Battle. Anyone know Battle? Oh, you do? Have you been there? Okay. Well, I recommend, if you and your parents and your brothers and sisters fancy a day out, go to Battle in East Sussex, because you can visit the battlefield and you can walk around it, and they give you little handheld devices and you can listen, and they tell you everything that happened during the battle as you walk around. It's really interesting, it's done really well. But to cut a long story short, the English were all on the top of the hill, and they all had shields, and the shields were all really close together, so they were almost like a wall of shields. They were standing so close together. And every time the Normans attacked them, they pushed them back with the shields, and they had great big axes on long poles that they smashed down on the Normans' heads. And for 6 hours, the Norman army kept trying to break through, and they couldn't. And then suddenly, they all seemed to run away down the hill. And the English said, hooray, we've won! And they charged down the hill after them, but it was a trap, it was a trick. because in the woods, unseen, were Norman knights on horses. And they then charged at the English and caused chaos and confusion. And then the Norman archers stepped forward. What are archers? So, someone I haven't asked. Yes, you, yes.
Bow and arrows.
Bows and arrows, yeah. Now the English had bows and arrows, but the Normans used them in a very different way. With the English, one man would fire an arrow and someone over there would fire an arrow, but the Normans had hundreds of archers, and they all fired their arrows at the same time. And they didn't fire them at people, they fired them up into the air. Can you imagine hundreds of arrows being fired up into the air at the same time? It made a great whoosh sound. So the English heard the sound and they all looked up, and the arrows all came down on them. You can imagine what happened. So the English, although they thought they'd won, actually they lost. And all the English leaders were killed. And so the Normans had the power, and they came to London, and the people in London basically said, oh, please don't hurt us, yes, we accept you as king. And on Christmas Day, 1066, William of Normandy was crowned King of England. And there's some sculpture of Norman knights. You can see what they look like with their pointy helmets and their swords. And that map shows England at the time of 1066. And you can see there that Sussex is marked, because that was still considered like a kingdom, and Wessex. And that shows you William's fleet of ships coming all the way up from Normandy, picking up more soldiers, and then coming over to fight the battle. But the Normans weren't just content to take over England, but they only took over England though. That's the thing. They didn't take over Wales, and they didn't take over Scotland, and they didn't take over Ireland. So we're only talking about England. And this shaded area is Norman land. So there's Normandy, where they lived, and they took over England, but they also took over all this part of France as well, and right down here. And where's that? Anyone recognise where that is? Yes? Italy, yeah. Southern Italy and Sicily. So these Normans, they were going everywhere, and they were beating everybody, and they were becoming very powerful and very rich. So really, when I'm talking about to you the year 900 to 1300, it's two stories really. It's from 900 to 1066 and then 1066 afterwards, because everything was different after 1066. There's a map of Sussex where we all live, and you can see there's different colours. And then what the Normans did is they divided Sussex up into 6 because they really didn't like or trust the people of Sussex. They thought, if we turn our backs for a second, these people in Sussex, they'll be attacking us and they'll be trying to get us out. So they divided the county into 6 blocks, and a river runs from north to south through each one of those divisions, and on each river they built a castle. And those castles, apart from one of them, those castles can still be seen today. So this was, they call them the rapes, and that comes from the word rope, the roped off areas. And this was Hastings Castle, Pevensey Castle, Lewis Castle, Bramber Castle, Arundel Castle, and Chichester Castle. And the only one that doesn't survive today is Chichester Castle. But if you go to Priory Park at Chichester, you can still see the mound on which the castle was built. But the other castles you can still see. Arundel Castle is still lived in. Bramber Castle is a ruin. Lewis Castle is a ruin, but there's a museum. Pevensey Castle is right down by the sea, and that's a ruin. And Hastings Castle is even more of a ruin, even more fallen down. But you can still see them. And to think they're still standing nearly 1,000 years later shows how well they were built. And the Normans, when they built big. The Saxons only had small buildings. The Normans had huge buildings, huge castles, and huge cathedrals, much, much bigger than anything the Saxon English had ever seen before. Now this is King Henry II. and he was a Norman king, and he was the grandson of William the Conqueror. And he became king when he was quite young, he was 18, and this shows him holding the church. And again, it's symbolic, it's saying, I am king, but also, remember that picture of Athelstan where he's bowing to the archbishop? This picture is more saying, I own the church. Church does what I tell them. And he ended up having a huge row, an argument, with his own archbishop, whose name was Thomas à Becket. A terrible, terrible row and a terrible argument. And it got so bad that one day the king was in Normandy with all his knights, drinking and eating, and perhaps drinking too much, so he was a bit drunk. And someone told him, oh, Thomas à Becket, he's preached a sermon against you. And the king was furious, absolutely livid. And he bashed the table and said, who will rid me of this turbulent priest? And turbulent means dangerous, distrustful person who's causing you trouble. And some of the knights listened to him and thought, if we kill the archbishop, the king will be really pleased with us. So without telling him, they went off, they crossed the sea back to England, they went to Canterbury where the archbishop was praying, and in his own cathedral, they cut him down with swords and killed him. But my goodness, what a row that caused. The people in the church were furious. Many people in England were furious, and the king realised that having the archbishop killed was not the right thing to have done, and he had to show penance. Anyone know what penance means? Pretty old-fashioned word, you don't hear it very often now. Basically, penance is saying you're sorry, but really sorry, and also showing you're sorry. And what the king had to do was he had to walk through the street, well, he had to crawl really through the streets of Canterbury on his knees, shuffling along on his knees, while 2 monks hit him with sticks as he crawled along, to show he was so sorry. And he built a shrine to Thomas à Becket. Oh, there, this is a famous picture. Thomas à Becket's on the right, and the king is on the left. They're not having a very good meeting there. And the king had this made, this beautiful box in which the bones of Thomas à Becket were kept. And everyone in England thought that Thomas à Becket was a most godly, saintly, perfect man. And they thought that if they went to where his bones were buried, that could help them with all sorts of problems in their lives. So there's no doctors, there's no medicine, not any medicine that worked. So if you were ill or you had a problem, people would walk hundreds of miles in groups. Now, I expect, who knows what's going to happen with COVID, but I expect some of you are looking forward to some holidays somewhere. If you don't go to France or Spain, maybe you go to Centre Parks, you've got a holiday booked, or you hope to have a holiday. In this medieval period, people didn't go on holidays, they went on pilgrimages. And that was where groups of people walked, sometimes hundreds of miles together, to go to somewhere like the shrine of Thomas à Becket. And when they got there, it would be all gold and huge and impressive, and they would kneel and they would pray, and they believed that that would help them in their lives. Now this brings us back to something local, near to us. So Thomas à Becket was made a saint. I'm saying, do you all know what a saint is? What's a saint? No? Anyone know what a saint is? Yes?
Someone who is like really important in religion.
Yes, important in religion and very holy. And often saints died in battle or were killed, and it was thought that they were more special than ordinary people, and that after they died you could pray to them and they'd listen to your prayers in heaven and they would help you. So Thomas à Becket was made a saint, and one of the bishops of Chichester, only one, was also made a saint, and his name was Richard. But no one knows he really looked like that. It's only a guess. There's no description of what he looked like. In the churchyard at Amberley, there's a big wall, and on the other side of the wall is a castle. And there's a gate through the wall, and you can see at the top there, St. Richard's Gate. because Amberley Castle was one of the homes of the bishops of Chichester. And Sir Richard was a very, very holy man. But he had a row with King Henry III. Now, fortunately, King Henry III didn't have him killed, but he wouldn't allow him permission to go into Chichester. So even though Richard was Bishop of Chichester, he couldn't go into Chichester. He couldn't go into the cathedral, and he couldn't live in the bishop's palace. So instead, he went to live there. Now, anyone know where that is? Is that familiar to anyone?
It's like
Tarring, yes.
Oh, it's
Yeah.
Tarring.
Yeah, that's the bishop's palace of Tarring.
Do you always think that there's somewhere local called Bishop's Palace? Yes.
And that's the oldest building in Worthing. And that's where Richard lived in the 1240s. And so, you know, I said about legends. Well, there's a legend about Richard that when he arrived at Tarring, he didn't arrive as lots of bishops did, in great robes, in a lovely carriage, with lots of riches. He arrived like a pilgrim, in a simple monk's habit, with a stave, in a big walking stick. And when he arrived, he gave thanks to God, and he pushed the stave into the ground, and miraculously it sprouted into a fig tree. That's the legend. You may not think that's very likely to be true, but that's the legend, yeah.
It's just a question. Was Finland like a place back then? Did it even exist?
It will. If I'm going to talk, I will talk about Finland at the end of the talk, yeah, and tell you about Finland. But if you go around Tarring today, you'll find there are lots of fig trees. Now, I took this picture a few days ago, and the trouble is, we're not quite fully in spring yet, are we? So not all the trees yet have got leaves on. So this poor fig tree, I think the leaves are just starting, you're just starting to see them come out. And so it's said that all the fig trees in Tarring grew from the original one planted by St Richard. And there's this plaque, the ancient fig gardens, 1745 or earlier. Well, 1745 is less than 300 years ago. So that doesn't mean the fig trees aren't older than that. It just means the only evidence, and going back to evidence again, the only evidence of the fig trees first we mentioned is 1745. But I think everyone thinks they are very, very old trees. That's a map. Do you know what that's supposed to be a map of? Yes.
Britain?
Yes. Yes.
The dinosaur at the top.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
What at the top?
Dinosaur.
Oh, it could be, couldn't it? Yeah. That's Scotland. Let's not tell Nicola Sturgeon it's not. But it doesn't look very much like England, does it? And it was, how could they know? How could they know what Britain, England looked like? They couldn't, could they? It was guesswork, and the guesswork on men who went round on boats, fishermen and traders, they had a general idea what England looked like, but we now know that it doesn't really look much like that, does it? If you were using that as a basis to travel around, you'd probably get lost very quickly. Oh, there's another picture of monks and nuns. So in this period, after 1066, I said the Normans built big castles and big churches. They also built big monasteries. And there are ruins of very big monasteries. Battle Abbey, Lewes Priory, Boxgrove Priory. They still survive as ruins. And instead of in Anglo-Saxon times, maybe you had 6 monks in an abbey or 6 nuns in a convent. But sometimes these big ones had 50 or 60. You know, they're much, much bigger. Right, anyone know where this is? Yes? Arundel, that's Arundel. And you can see Arundel Castle just poking over the trees. But actually, Arundel Castle is a bit of a fake, because a lot of what you see isn't medieval. It was actually built in the late Victorian period, not much more than 100 years ago, by the 15th Duke of Norfolk, who some said was the richest man in England. He had so much money, he built all this sort of, it's like a fairy tale castle, like something from a Disney film. So there are old bits of Arundel Castle, but most of what you see from the road isn't old. But those ruins on the right, you see the ruins? They are the ruins of the Black Friars Monastery. So that was one of those monasteries I told you about. And the Black Friars were very famous for taking in the sick and people who were unwell. And there's Amberley Castle. But healing the sick. So there's a doctor, and just to let you know this man isn't very well, his tongue looks rather swollen and red, and something rather bad's happened on the top of his head.
How is he alive?
Well, I thought that was like a mustache.
And he's got his arm in a sling. Yeah. Did you say how is he alive?
No, he's got a huge gap in his
He has a huge gash in his head. And these people are making medicines, but really the medicines weren't very good. And you know, at the very beginning of the talk, when I was asking you how old great-grandparents were, and you were saying you had great-grandparents who were 90. In these days, if you lived to be 50, that was very old. People didn't live very long, because if they got ill, they'd probably die, especially if they were living in towns that weren't healthy places, because there's lots of sewage and dirt everywhere. And doctors didn't necessarily do you a lot of good. And here's another lovely, beautiful coloured picture. These are friars looking after the sick. So the people in the middle of the picture here, they're all pretty ill, and the friars are praying for them, which might have done more good than the doctors, actually, to be honest. Gift for a king. In medieval times, medieval kings loved to give each other gifts. So if they weren't fighting wars with each other, they were trying to flatter each other. They were trying to find, in some ways, when they gave a present, they were saying, look, I'm more powerful than you, I can give you this amazing present, and you could never give me a present as good as my present. And this is obviously an elephant, and this was given as a present to King Henry III of England by the King of France. And poor old elephant, I don't think he probably had much of a good life in Henry III's England. But really the King of France was saying, look at me, I'm really special and powerful. I can give you a present of an elephant, and you've probably never seen an elephant before. So it was a sort of, it was a present, but it was also saying, I'm better than you. And these are just a few little drawings of people doing everyday work. So these people are bricklayers building the bricks. So in the late medieval period, for the first time, they start to build with bricks. There weren't any bricks in Saxon England. And these show various things at work. So this person is weaving. Any idea what this chap's doing? Yes?
It looks like he's cleaning the inside of a shoe.
Yeah, he's actually making a shoe. And they would have been leather shoes, and not like shoes we've got today really, with soles. They were just sort of thick leather that you pulled on and tied up around your legs. And there you've got fishermen, and there's someone hunting. Hunting was very popular. They didn't have football matches to go to, or cricket matches, or basketball. They went hunting. But it was only the rich that could hunt. If poor people hunted, they risked getting into an awful lot of trouble. And there were land that was owned by the king was called a forest. So if you come across a forest like Ashdown Forest or the New Forest, it doesn't actually mean a place with trees, it actually means a royal hunting ground. But they tended to have trees in them because that made for better hunting. Any idea? And here's a question for you. What animals do you think lived in the Sussex countryside, in Sussex woods, in medieval times that we don't have today? What were you going to say?
Deer.
They did hunt deer, so that's a good. They did hunt deer, definitely. But what else?
Fox.
Not foxes, not in those days.
Oh,
I mean, there were foxes, I think, but they didn't hunt them. Yes?
So like big birds.
Well, they use big birds for hunting, like hawks and eagles. But the animals that lived, certainly in the early medieval period, in the forest you had wolves. So you know the story of Little Red Riding Hood? The point of that story is a warning. It's a warning, don't go into the woods on your own, because the big bad wolf might gobble you up. And that was a real danger. There really were wolves that were hunted, and boar. Anyone know what a boar is? Yes?
Isn't it like kind of like a pig, but just a bit bigger?
Bigger and more aggressive, and with big tusks. So they hunted boar. And the other thing that people, yes?
In these days, don't people, like, so say they hunt, they get their dog to go and fetch it, like a pointer?
Yes, yeah, I've heard of that, yes. And I think people still hunt with their dogs today, don't they? Pheasants and partridge and that type of thing. These are 2 nights jousting. Now, some of you, when you've been on holiday, you may have seen a recreation of jousting, or have you seen that? Yeah. So, but of course, they don't really hurt themselves, do they? They're sort of pretending. But in medieval times, you'd have 2 men charging each other on horseback with these great long lances, and sometimes people were killed, but it was very popular. Hundreds and hundreds of people would go and watch a joust, as it was called. There's a weaver. This is a picture from about 1300 of a group of monks looking up to the sky. And at one time, when they looked up at the sky at night, and they saw the stars twinkling, some people thought that what they were looking at was heaven was above the sky. The sky was a great big dome, and the saints had made little holes in the sky, and where the light was coming through from heaven, that were the stars. But by 1300s, some monks realised that some of these stars were actually planets, like our own planet, and they started to realise that actually the Earth wasn't flat, it might be round, and the sky wasn't a dome, that was just an illusion, and beyond the sky were other planets. They were just starting to think like that. That's a picture of what Chichester looked like in the late medieval times. You can see how busy it is, full of people on market day, some on horseback, people carrying fruit and vegetable on their shoulders. A busy, noisy, dirty, smelly place. In fact, if we went back in history in a time machine, I think the 2 things that would strike you first is, wow, there's hardly anybody here. And the second thing would be, oh, what a stink. Because they didn't really get rid of sewage very well. In towns, particularly in the summer, it could be very, very smelly. And this is my final picture. Now, you all know where this is, don't you? Yes, St John the Baptist Church at Finland. Now, so coming back to what you were saying about Finland. There's quite a few different ideas as to what Finland means. The one I like most is that the idea that Finland means Woodpecker Hill. And that's because Finn was an Old English name for a woodpecker. And Don is from where we get, we talk about the downs, but in Sussex dialect they were the dunes. And that's, so Finn Don is Woodpecker Hill. But not everyone thinks, everyone agrees the Don bit means a hill, but not everyone agrees about the Woodpecker bit. But I like the Woodpecker bit, that's nice to think, Woodpecker Hill. But that tells us that the original Finland village was very near a hill, whereas this village isn't really on a hill. And have you noticed, do you go as a school to the church? So you've all been to the church. What do you notice about the church? What's around the church? Yeah.
Like farmlands?
Farmland, yeah. But often when you go to a village or town, what's around the church? Yeah.
Roads, just.
Roads, houses. It's a bit strange, isn't it? You go to Finland Church, it's all on its own, surrounded by fields. And the reason is that it used to be in the middle of the village. It used to have houses all the way around it. But in 1348, the worst illness in the history of the world came to England. And this was called the plague or the Black Death. Now today, if you've got plague, a doctor would give you antibiotics and you'd be well again in a few days. But in 1348, no such medicines existed, and it was a terrible, terrible illness. And some people think that maybe half the people in England died. So it was the worst thing that could have happened. And in some villages, so many people died that those who were still alive thought, this is such a miserable, unhappy place, I don't want to live here anymore. So they'd make a new village, maybe half a mile away or a mile away. So that's why this school is here and not up by the church. Yes?
I live like near the fields that's kind of surround the church, kind of near there. And me and my dad were walking past there, and they're like in the floor we saw some like old bricks from a house and stuff.
Ah.
I'm pretty sure, and like just random bits and stuff.
So you think that might be from the old buildings?
Yeah.
I mean, it could be. Maybe one day archaeologists will come and dig around and find what's there. So that was not a good time to be alive. But gradually, of course, things improved and got better. So so there you are. That's medieval England and Sussex in a nutshell. So I hope you found it interesting. And if you have any questions, I'll try and answer them.
Anyone got any questions?
Yeah.
Casper?
About the knuckers thing,
Yeah.
if they like breathe fire, why didn't people see forest burning and then they still believed it? Like, oh, there's no evidence, I'm just going to believe it.
Well, perhaps they thought there was evidence. People can. There's a phrase called mass hysteria. I don't know if you want to do a Google search on mass hysteria, and that's something that even sometimes happens at schools. I've read it at schools where there's a school assembly and a girl or boy faints, and then everyone else starts fainting because they're not really ill, but they're But so in those days, people could think they'd actually seen the fire-breathing dragon, and they could come back and say, yes, the whole forest was on fire. And someone else said, well, I've just come through there an hour ago, it wasn't. Well, they witchcraft it back again, you know. So people could get very, very frightened. Yes?
Because of like old brick houses, how come like some of the old houses have, I don't know, fallen over time, or obviously because the land's height increases and they sort of get almost sucked into the land. How come churches don't?
Well, they would, of course, if you left them.
Okay.
If you left a church and didn't do any maintenance on it, it would eventually fall down. That's part of the answer to the question. The other part of the answer is that churches were well built, whereas the sort of houses that the peasants lived in, the poor people, weren't well built. And they fall down much more easily.
What they made up, like sometimes even like instead of using like cement and stuff, they would use poo.
Yeah, that's right. Wattle and daub. So they get clay and, as you say, various forms of dung from animals, and they mix that all together into cement, and they make a sort of fence out of split sticks and weave them together, and then just lay all this stuff on them until it dried. It would have done, yeah, it would have stunk. Yeah.
About with the people on the horses, like with the, like when they like went into each
Well, they were jousting, yeah.
Yeah. What was actually on the end of the sort of stick things?
Well, I think they were doing it for fun. It would be something that was flat. But of course, if they were doing it in battle, it would have a point on it, like a spear, like a huge spear. Any other questions? I'll ask you a question. Put your hand up if you've lived in Finland all your life. Okay. Keep your hand up if both your parents have lived in Finland all their life. Ah, see? You're a true Finland person.
Could you go to grandparents as well? When we grew Nan, did you know your nan or your great nan? Don't know. You are a well-established family.
So you're special.
Yeah.
And actually, you've got that fair hair, which was the colouring of the Anglo-Saxon people. So perhaps your family have been here 1,000 years. Who knows?
The mosaics that are made with children 10 odd years ago, the man that made the frame for it, he came to this school and he was a grandparent of the child. And he's been here as his children and then his grandchildren.
So, 100 years ago, there'd have been a lot more of you who would have had parents who were born here as well. So, we move around much more than we used to, yeah.
Around what time was Finland actually made?
The first village, you mean?
Yeah.
I can't tell you exactly without looking it up, but this part of Sussex was settled quite early. So I would guess, it's only a guess, I would guess there were probably people living in Finland at the old village by 600 AD probably. And there may have been people living here before that, but of course there was no writing. So unless archaeologists discover a building, you can't know for sure. Yeah.
Also, another question is how do you really make a village? Does somebody just walk around and make a house and say this is Finland?
That's a great question. Villages basically started, if you imagine the original Anglo-Saxons coming here on boats to live here, they would have come in a big family group. So if you imagine not just your mum and dad, sisters and brothers, but all your cousins and maybe second cousins all coming over in a big group. Maybe 50 people, maybe 100. So you'd all want to live together. So that's how the village would start. And of course, each different family would have their own house. So maybe the village would start with only 4 or 5 houses, and then gradually over time it would get bigger and bigger. Yeah.
When did Finland or England get discovered?
Oh, discovered by who though? That's the thing, isn't it? This is where it gets quite confusing, and this will confuse. This is probably not helpful, really. But the English are the people who are the Anglo-Saxons. That's where we get the name English from. It's actually from the Angles, the Anglish, which became English. So there weren't any people called English until about 500 AD. Before that, there were Romans here, and there were people that we now call the Celts, but they didn't call themselves Celts. That's what people call them later. So, but if you mean who were the first human beings to come to this land before it had the names it's got now, well, people used to say it was about 20 to 30,000 years ago. But there was an excavation done at Boxgrove near Chichester about 20 years ago, and they found remains of human-type people of 500,000 years ago, which is mind-blowing, 500,000 years. They weren't even Homo sapien like we are. They were a different type of human. And then they think those people all died out, and then no one lived here again for ages and ages and ages. And the whole of what's now England was covered in deep, impenetrable forest. And then from about 10 to 12,000 years ago, people arrived, and they were able to get, because England was joined to the rest of Europe by land. But at the end of the last ice age, when all the seawater rose up and up and up, the land was taken away, and that's when England became an island. So the answer to the question is, when was England discovered? It depends how far back you're going, really. Hard question to answer. Good question.
Any other questions? No, I think lots to think about them to go backwards. Thank you very much, that was brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for all your great questions as well.
Yeah,
I've really
very
enjoyed
good.
it. Thank you.